Hello and welcome to another episode of Patiently. My name's Christian Fletcher Walker. I'm the CEO of WhatMed, and we are running today a podcast with Heath Caban. Did I say the name right there? Caban or Caban?
Both are okay.
Both are okay. Heath is a father of three, two-time surrogacy user. Heath is a husband to Tom and has used surrogacy to have his son about 6 years ago in Thailand, and more recently in Cambodia and China for the birth of their twin girls. So that is definitely something you weren't prepared for, hey Heath?
No, it definitely wasn't. Wasn't something we were expecting.
That was one of the questions I popped in. What weren't you prepared for? And that was the first thing you put, twins.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yes. And, a possible outcome always, but after so many attempts and not being successful so many times, to then get the positive and a double positive, it was a bit of a shock.
How many attempts did you have to go through?
I think the first time around with our son Alexander, when we look back on it, was a really easy process. We got pregnant the first attempt. We had good egg retrieval, so we had a good number of embryos, and then we put one in, and bam, Alex came out. With the twins, it was I think it was three visits to 2 different countries to organise attempts. I think it was something like 7 different transfers into different surrogates and numerous, obviously, IVF processes. So it wasn't fun. I think that process sort of took about 2 years to actually fall pregnant with the twins.
And I bet that was quite emotional as well, with the waiting and then the letdown and then the trying again.
Oh, it's a complete roller coaster.
Yeah.
Not only there's an added complication with surrogacy, which means is versus just normal IVF, which is also a complete roller coaster.
Yeah.
But with surrogacy, there's international time zones, there's language issues, there's travel, so that to have this constant, we've tried again, it costs another X thousands of dollars, like all IVF attempts. We've tried again, it's failed, or I think we had one experience where we got to about 12 weeks pregnant, and nothing, and there was no progress, but there was a positive pregnancy, so we had to, but no progress, so we had to terminate that experience. So it's not fun.
No, it's and I've interviewed a couple other people on the podcast about IVF, and they were saying as well that there wasn't much preparation for the emotional draw and challenge. They're quite technical and very frank about potential outcomes, but the time and the waiting seems to be a similar story.
Yeah, and you do have to focus on that technical side, because the everything else is a bit unknown and out of control and up to Mother Nature. So all you can do is focus on the technicalities of IVF, of your egg collection, of your sperm collection, of the quality of embryos, of the quality of the surrogate, and the quality of her uterus before transfer. I have learned more about IVF and understand more about IVF than your standard woman that gets pregnant or even goes through IVF, because we've done it so many times, and because you had to sort of understand it because of international experiences. Yeah.
And what do you get any choice over the surrogate? Is there like a choice, or they choose for you? Do you meet them?
So it's complete buyer's choice in I guess through from the egg donor's perspective. Obviously, being 2 gay men, we had an excess of sperm and no eggs.
Mm.
So we had to acquire eggs, and so that's a process that you and probably to be honest, probably the more, because your child will then have the genetic markings of this person. You want to probably spend a bit more time on the egg donor selection. So that is a long process. I think the first round with our son, it was someone we knew, so that was a relatively simple selection process.
Okay.
And the second round with the girls wasn't, and so we had to, you offered profiles, and you review, you have video calls and video chats because these people are often overseas, and then you make selection, and then that person then goes on, under a treatment process, and then they either qualify or not. So a lot of the times before you even start IVF, you could fall over with the egg donor because she mightn't respond properly to the medication and the stimulation treatment, and so you get the call to say, well, it looks like there's only 10 follicles growing in her ovaries, so we're going to stop treatment because that if there's 10 follicles, that might result in 1 or 2 good quality eggs being retrieved, which is not the number you want. You obviously want in excess of, it's probably not obvious, but you want in excess of 20 or so.
Okay.
And then you also have to line up, and this is where sort of my project management experience comes in handy. You have to line up then a surrogate to also be available at around the same time, because you don't, you just timing wise, the ideal situation is you are transferring fresh embryos on day 5 into a surrogate that's ready, but that requires the surrogate to be ready as well, with the right level of treatment and returning positive scans around her uterus preparation, and so that doesn't always happen, and you end up freezing embryos and then transferring 1 or 2 months later. So, and the surrogate, similar process. You're often offered 1 or 2 candidates, and you look at them and their experience in having children before, what was that like, etc., etc. The surrogates, often there's more of a language barrier, so there wasn't any phone calls. There wasn't. With our son, we met our surrogate when we transferred, because we were there, and then again at birth, because it was in Thailand, so we only went twice.
Right.
And with our daughters, we weren't there at transfer because we'd been sort of 3 times already on 3 different occasions, and ended up being a frozen transfer. So and then at birth we spent probably 2 weeks together, in and out of hospital, and seeing her, and post birth as well for about a week. Yeah.
Okay. You said here as well that keeping contact with the surrogate is quite important for future legal documents. I was actually going to ask you what sort of relationship you would have, or does the child have, with the surrogate over there?
Yeah, I think it's probably. I always think of it as there's always so many people involved in a surrogate baby's journey, and 2 very important people in this process. Obviously, the egg donor, and the surrogate. Not to mention, obviously, the intended parents as well, of which you assume probably in a gay same-sex marriage that's one of the males, but not always, as a sperm donor. Yeah. But for the other 2, the other 2 important people are the egg donor and the surrogate. And we have always thought that it's important to maintain a relationship with those people, and for our children to know who they are,
Yeah.
and that be part of their story. So obviously our twins are 11 months old, so that's not part of their dialect at the moment.
Oh, yeah. But Alexander's aware of his.
But Alexander, yeah, is totally
Do
aware of
you
her.
call him? Do you call her the mother?
No. So we use terms like eggy mummy
Right.
and tummy mummy, and so that's always been part of his vocabulary from a very young age. And we talk about them and their names, and there's been video calls, and as he gets older, and obviously he's got a book that we wrote with pictures of the journey, and photos of us, and surrogate, and his eggy mummy and his tummy mummy, and all of that. So it's just a normal part of, or we try and normalize as much as possible for a non-standard or a non-common, I use the term non-common process.
Yeah.
And so we just try and normalize that and make it part of his journey. We also made a conscious decision from a very young age to not talk about with other people, not talk about, who is the egg donor, who is the sperm donor, to not talk about those things with other people until our son was of the age where he knew that, could understand it, could comprehend it, and then it's his information, because it's really his information to then be open to talk about. So it's not like he comes along and then everyone else knows this information and he's the last person to know, kind of thing. And you still get silly comments from people who don't intend to, but because Christian in this surrogacy, especially same-sex surrogacy, it's so uncommon that the language doesn't exist for people. So you get people in work environments, etc., who are completely harmless, who say things like, "Well, yeah, but who's the real father?" I'm talking. I've been asked that, probably 10 plus times, and so I try to let my blood not boil, because obviously that's
a really hard thing. Yeah, it's
and explain that's the wrong way to ask that question.
Yeah. But I guess as well, you're right in saying that if people aren't exposed to these situations very often, then they aren't aware of what you say and what you don't say, and what's considered rude or what's not, and because they have no idea what you've been through. It's very easy to be, it's very difficult, I'd imagine.
Yeah.
Very difficult. So, obviously, with anyone that would listen to this in the future, what would be your top 5 tips for others seeking surrogacy?
So I think when it comes to surrogacy, and assuming that I'm assuming that we're talking about surrogacy offshore, outside of the country that we live in, because I live in Australia, and surrogacy is very uncommon in Australia because commercial surrogacy is still illegal. So you've got one option in Australia, which is altruistic surrogacy, which is I know someone over here, and my sister-in-law, for example, I know a couple that have done this. My sister-in-law is able to have our children, so she's going to go through the process of having that and doing it out of the goodness of her heart, and it's not a commercial transaction. It's obviously very rare. What inevitably happens, and I know happens in Australia, is that it's called altruistic surrogacy, but in effect, people are paid. And so that's not. And so, we were approached by people in Australia when we were going through the process to do that, and we said no, that's not what we wanted, because we didn't want to break any Australian laws, obviously. So assuming this is offshore, then I think one of the first things you're all obsessed about, rightly so, about the journey you started about having a child, bringing a child into your life, and but one of the things you need to think about is when this child arrives in this offshore country, how are you going to exit that country? Because I think thinking about the end, thinking about that plane ride home, when you've gone through this process, will determine which countries are in and out of your selection criteria. So think about how to exit the country, on what passport, on what visa, what letters and documents, who will be on the flight, and just planning the departure will sort of help you think about where to go. So, for example, our son was born in Thailand. It was before Thailand went into a military coup and then issued a decree saying that surrogacy was now illegal. And so it was it was a grey area because it wasn't legal or not legal. There's no legislation about it either way, but it was relatively easy to leave the country. We still did things like have the surrogate at the airport. She was interviewed at the airport, given authority for Alexander to leave. And then, whereas, it's now illegal in Thailand, and whilst people still are doing it, you need to think about how you leave and where do you fly to, and if you fly or you train or whatever it might be. So I think planning that, and then you've got countries like America where it's a lot simpler. There's laws about it, and then you just got to think about distance and all that kind of stuff. So
maybe the other thing there you mentioned is just to prepare the embassy and get a process from them somehow with documentation. So, yeah. Talking to the embassy, creating a relationship with people at the embassy. We had fantastic experience with the embassy people in Thailand. Less fantastic people with the Australian embassy in China, who are very, very difficult to deal with. Right.
I think keep it simple is one of my other keys as well. There'll be lots of decisions to be made around passports, birth certificates, doctors, hospitals, all that kind of stuff. Follow a path that's been
beaten path,
and check with other people who have done it and follow that. In the girl's case, no one has had IVF in Cambodia, transferred into a Thai surrogate and then a birth in China, and then left with as Australian citizens on Australian passports, left China. The embassy in China just said this has never happened, so we don't know what to do, and so it took a lot longer. Whereas Thailand rock up and it was, yes, we know we have someone who's dedicated to surrogacy, and we know, and this is a process, and we're out in sort of 5 weeks. China for 12 weeks. Right. So keep it simple. Don't try and overcomplicate it, which I can talk from experience that I have on.
sounds like it, yeah.
I think maintain a relationship with the surrogate and/or egg donor. Egg donor is probably for more emotional and connectivity reasons for the child, in my opinion. And surrogate is also that's true as well, but you need the surrogate for legal documents until passport, for example. You need the surrogate to sign a passport document every when you come back, and then probably every 5 years until the 18. So the Australian government, if whoever's name is on the birth certificate is the mother, then the Australian government, no matter what relationship she had, whether she was a surrogate or whatever it was, but the Australian government will always want her to approve passport documentation, and then and then there's other complications like losing a birth certificate, which hasn't happened, and et cetera, et cetera. I think once you're in the country, once you're back here, besides the passport, things like schooling, Medicare, doctors, hospitals, that's never an issue. I think we're very lucky in Australia around, parent or guardian, and it's never come up not once with our son in the last 6 years in Australia has anyone ever requested that we involve the surrogate, except for passports. That's the only thing.
Yeah. Okay.
So if you think about all the things you have to do as a common biological parent, you have to sign so many documents all the time for children. Not once has it ever come up except the passport. So that's really positive experience.
Very interesting.
And then also, so then the question is, well, if you're choosing international surrogacy, you will no doubt need to engage with lots of people to do that.
Yeah.
And you either have a choice of going directly with an IVF clinic, which is very common in places like America, and was common in Thailand, or you choose an agent. So there are a lot of surrogacy agents out there. There's a lot in Australia, there's a lot in Thailand, there's a lot in India, and there's obviously a lot in America. And so choosing the right agent, if that's the path you're going to choose, is very important. You know, we've both used direct IVF clinics and multiple agents. I think we're up to 3. And my advice is to choose an agent in the country that you're going to go to.
Yeah, the destination country. Yeah.
And whilst you sacrifice things like language, so it's much easier to choose an Australian agent, pick up the call, Australian phone number, and you know they're here in country, and they speak your language. Inevitably, you know, you end up in a game of, you know, multiple parties, Chinese whispers, language barriers, and my advice is to use the agent in the country, who's the person who's choosing the surrogate, meeting with the surrogate, the person who's going to be there when the IVF happens. You know, having that direct connectivity, whilst it means, you know, international calling and you know, technologies around that, like, you know, WhatsApp and WeChat, all that kind of stuff, and language problems. You know, you won't get perfect English. It does mean you have a closer connectivity. It removes one step of complexity, and it's inevitably where we got to with being successful with the twins. So we chose an agency that wasn't in Thailand, and then in the end we ended up, after spending quite a lot of money with them, ditched that and went direct. So that would be my advice. And if you're choosing places like America or other countries, Canada, then just go direct with the IVF clinic, because they're the people that are, you know, the most important in the process.
Yeah. And you mentioned here when I asked how could a surrogacy provider improve what they do or how they do it, you went on with communication. What do you mean by that?
Well, you know, obviously in all this waiting process, you want to be kept up to date, because you are at home getting on with your life, but with this little thing in your stomach all the time, thinking about what's happening. So communication, in knowing where you're at in a process. So because of that project management experience, I guess, you know, I would want to know what are the steps, and where are we at, and what are the possible outcomes as we get to each step, and what are the time frames that I'm going to know things. So, you know, if we're transferring into a surrogate our embryos, then, you know, I want to know that at, you know, in 11 days or 7 days, there's going to be a P test, and then after that there's going to be, you know, a blood test, and after that there's going to be a heart rate.
Right.
And how long do each of those things
mapping
take?
it out a little bit more and giving you a bit of a better expectation.
Yeah, around dates, and as opposed to, you know, what inevitably ends up happening is you are just constantly asking questions. When's that going to happen? When's that going to happen? When's that going to happen?
Yeah.
And then, you know, mixed communication, broken language, and you know, and confusion. You know, and it can seem a bit cold, because you've got to remember you're dealing with an agency that has no emotional, you know,
difficult.
You mightn't have met yet, et cetera, and they're dealing with 100 different customers. Some of these agents are dealing directly with other agents in those countries, and so they are very frank with their language, and sometimes can be frank with you. So don't expect,
Nice.
loving letdowns. You'll get a message saying, test done, not pregnant. That experience has cost you X amount of money and X amount of time and emotional investment, hope, and then you get 4 words. So improving communication,
I guess, though, to be on the other coin of that is that at least with that, I mean, it's difficult, isn't it? I was just thinking through, there's no confusion there. It sounds and feels cold, but it's what it is. And I've not been through it, so I don't know.
And this is where you do need to, in a surrogacy situation, you do need to sometimes, park your emotions and save all that to when, these beautiful little people come into your life, and think about and try to park the emotional side of it and think on the, you're going through a process, you're going through a medical procedure.
Yeah.
And, that medical procedure should be very clinical and should be very methodical and emotions and prayers and, have little to do with it. But that's easy to say and very hard to do for different people,
absolutely.
And so you just got to be aware of that.
And so you mentioned here that obviously the pros of surrogacy are you become a parent and it allows you to have children for whatever reason that is. But can you talk through some of the cons maybe a little bit more, so people that are considering it might have a wider scope in their decision making?
Yeah, and I think one of the other pros, besides just the obvious one for us, which is to be able to have a child or children now. One of the other pros is surrogacy is very good at keeping you. I'm going to contradict myself a little bit now, but you do get a lot more information than I know that friends of mine who have been pregnant next to me through a more common pregnancy. You get a lot more information, so you get a lot more. You get more choices around testing and choices of embryos. Right. You get a lot more information during, some of my friends couldn't believe that we were getting scans and results every 2 weeks on how things were progressing and measurements, and other people who have gone through a standard pregnancy, probably not getting that same interaction and information. So that's another pro, I guess. And then the cons, well, I guess, the cost is a huge one. But also legality. I think one of the things people who are thinking about going into surrogacy should look into with a measured sense of concern is legality about who is the parent of the child.
Right.
Because it's not legal in Australia, Australia doesn't recognises then that the parents as the people on the birth certificate, and Thailand, for example, only recognises the mother as the legal guardian on the birth certificate.
Right.
So you have a situation in Thailand where children are being born through surrogacy, but the sperm donor or the father listed on the birth certificate has no legal rights, which it is a concern if you're going back to Thailand and on a holiday and about. And so just the legalities of it. Whereas countries like America, which can be, and I've got friends that have done it through America, and I think Canada, but don't quote me on that. You can have only one parent on the birth certificate, so you can leave the country with a birth certificate that's just got one parent, which is obviously the father or the intended parent, and then the surrogate is not on the birth certificate, and then there's never any questions about that. It's a very long and lengthy process to come back to Australia and then have courts award parentage of the other person who's not the other person in the relationship who's not listed on the birth certificate.
Yeah.
And it's not
Got to be
something.
quite tough as well, really.
Sorry.
That's got to be quite tough as well.
Well, yeah, and it's not something we've considered. Well, it's not something we've done. It's something we've considered, because there's mixed reviews about A, how effective it is anyway, and B, how is it required, sort of. And we haven't found that there's been any need for it to be required. But just think about that in surrogacy. It's probably the biggest, besides the cost. It's probably the biggest con of doing surrogacy is the whole, where does it leave you and your legal rights with your children, because they're your children, and after a year, no one's going to debate that, but legally, you mightn't have full legal custody of those children.
So something to be prepared on and be well versed and read on, and have a few. Hence, having a good relationship with the surrogates. Should you need extra documentation or representation, yes. I guess.
Yeah.
God. Well, I mean, again, I've said it before, but congratulations again on the twins. I gather they had a wonderful Christmas.
Yeah, they did. I mean, it's funny. I just realised we're talking about surrogacy and the process and the pros and cons and all that. I guess there's no regrets from our part, because where we're at is we've got a beautiful family of 5, and that's an amazingly rewarding experience. Yeah. And the girls are very healthy and happy and beautiful, and we wouldn't think of it any other way, and have no regrets about the process. And that's the other thing, is when you're in the process, it seems daunting and it's never ending and it's never going to happen. Yeah. And then these children come along, and that is all forgotten and replaced with a whole new set of challenges, which I know you understand, Christian, around all the standard challenges, all the common challenges that endure about raising 1-year-olds, 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, grumpy 5-year-olds, and all the way through. So it's just forgotten, and then you're on to your life, which you have to remind yourself when it's hard, and you've got we're out at dinner last night, and the restaurant's loud. The girls are talking. They're not screaming. They're just they're not upset. They're just loud. Because they've got age of testing their voice, and Alex, our son's in the background, baba, 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 talking, my phone's ringing, and it's all go, and I'm just thinking, you got to take a breath and remind yourself that you did this by design, and you actually pursued this dream. This didn't happen by accident, and you just got to remind yourself that you wanted this, and all the rewarding part of it. But very much just now a normal parent with 3 happy but a lot of work children.
It is a lot of work. As you know, I've got 2. It is super hard work, and I just can relate to going through the pain, and you get to this wonderful time. Like, I mean, Kerry's gone through a lot more than I have, but she's been through the morning sickness, the 9 months pregnancy, and then the birth, and both came through cesarean. And after a little while, there gets to this point where you're just so in love with it all. It's all so wonderful, and should we have another? And it's it's just a case of hang on. We've been through a lot. It's been really, really difficult. And obviously there's risks involved in going again. But I can relate to how easy it is to forget the struggle.
Yes.
Even though it's a different struggle. So. But well, look, Heath, thank you so much for sharing all of that. It's I'm sure anyone looking to take up surrogacy is going to find this extremely useful. And I think you left a review on whatmed.com under, is it First Fertility?
Yes, first fertility. That's right. Yes,
Yeah. So if anyone
Yes.
wants to read that review, they can see it there. And I think through the WhatMed platform, you can, if Heath has made it possible, reach out to Heath to ask him any questions if you're going down this road. And if not, then talk to WhatMed or even contact First Fertility. But again, thanks, Heath. And I will sign off for today with the Patiently podcast. And remember to follow us, like us, and stay tuned, and there'll be more coming up in the next few weeks.